Hello and welcome to this ETOA snapshot session. I'm Rachel Reed and I'm joined by our resident tourism stats expert, David Edwards. Today we are going to be discussing tourism stats and surveys, so things to bear in mind when looking at them and potential pitfalls that one can fall into when looking at surveys and stats. David, do please kick us off.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. And I'm going to start by talking about how easy it is to get confused by tourism statistics and surveys. So it is a challenge to describe metrics with detailed definitions without getting really confused. For example, UNWTO defines visitor as, get ready, a visitor is a traveller taking a trip to a main destination outside his/her usual environment for less than a year for any main reason, brackets, business, leisure, or other personal purpose, close brackets, other than to be employed by a resident entity in the country or place visited. A visitor, domestic, inbound, or outbound, is classified as tourist or overnight visitor if his/her trip includes an overnight stay, or as a same-day visitor or excursionist otherwise. And the words that were in yellow there, they all have their own rather long-winded definition as well. So you might think it's really easy to say, what's a visitor? Well, it turns out it's a little bit more complicated. It's also worth noting that the same person will be counted as a visitor to a destination each time he or she makes a trip within a reference period. So some people might tell you that 40 million overseas residents came to the UK in 2019. Well, not quite. There were 40 million visits by overseas residents, but many of those visits would have been made by the same people doing more than one trip. So let's talk about official versus unofficial surveys and tourism statistics. There is a plethora of tourism surveys and statistics on both demand and supply, but they are often difficult to compare and sometimes appear to be contradictory. Now, we often find that governments will typically focus on publishing data on headlines such as the overall volume and value of tourism in a destination, but that will often come with quite a time lag. Then we've got businesses such as airlines and hotel groups who will release data with greater timeliness, but of course their data will only be relaying information about one small part of the overall tourism landscape. Then there are bespoke surveys that frequently shine a light on attitudes and behaviours, for example, those relating to sustainability. But every survey is subject to a range of sorts of errors. What are those survey errors that we might need to be mindful of? Well, there is often a laser-like focus on how many respondents there are in a survey. This matters as it impacts what is called sampling error, but other considerations, often overlooked, can be equally important. For example, there's something called measurement error, and that can come about if you've got poor question design or have faulty assumptions, or indeed deploy poor interviewing techniques. Then there's coverage error, which is those who are interviewed are not representative of the wider population that you're trying to get insights about. And this can come about due to poor sample frame. For example, failing to interview airport passengers at weekends and in the evenings might be a mistake if we just rely on data from interviews during 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And then we've got non-response error, which is a case of those not responding having different characteristics to those who do respond. And the shorthand for that is bias. So some points to ponder for our little discussion. First one is being consistently imperfect preferable to frequently changing methodology to improve robustness? Now, a second point to ponder, should there be greater focus on statistics and surveys that describe the situation as it is today, as opposed to how it was a year or two ago? And last but certainly not least, is when interpreting surveys about attitudes and opinions, is who is it that is saying this just as important a question as what are they saying? So Rachel, some things for us to chat about there.
Yes, absolutely, David. And I mean, I think your first point there really resonates with me as someone working in tourism insight, where when people change methodologies or timeframes, etc., it does make it very difficult to spot trends. So often you'll go to a survey and say, oh, how does that compare with the last time? And then you'll see, but we have changed the definition of traveller since last we wrote it. And it kind of constantly shifting the goalpost does make it very difficult to get robust trends. And I think there is an argument that says actually spotting a trend is more beneficial than having 100% accurate data.
Indeed, and it can be more meaningful to businesses as well to be able to know that the overall trend for leisure or for business or for inbound or for domestic is up 3% or down 3% than to be told the absolute number, because every business will hopefully know how their performance compares with last year and the year before, and it will just be easier in many ways for them to think, okay, we're doing all right, if they know that they can compare their trend with a national or regional trend in a consistent way. So there are some times where you think, well, I know this survey isn't perfect, but actually I value the fact that I've got a wonderful time series here. And if we change it, then we'll have a step change, and money is clearly very limited. And so what you will always find is you won't get what is called parallel running. You won't deploy two methodologies at the same time to properly analyze what difference is being made by a methodological change. You just make the change and say, oh, we've made the change. Numbers aren't quite comparable.
Yes, absolutely. And that actually really leads on to the second point for us to think about, which is this idea of timeliness of data perhaps being more important and beneficial than size of survey, etc., because it's obviously some of the ones that are done on a very large scale can take up to sort of 18 months to come through, by which time it's you can't really do anything with it as a business. I suppose it might still be relevant at the policy level, but certainly for businesses, there is a great desire for fleet of foot when it comes to data sources.
Absolutely, and almost even at the policy level, given that we seem to be living in an era of very rapidly changing circumstances, it's almost a case of saying, well, however perfectly you've got to this set of figures, if they're telling me about what happened in 2019, that is meaningless because so very much has changed. So this is perhaps a need for us to think about other ways of gauging tourism, not necessarily as a replacement to some of those surveys, but as a supplement. For example, can more use be made of things like mobile phone data? Can more use be made of things such as credit and debit card transaction data, just to get a feel for what's happening on a day-to-day basis of the overall volume of visits?
Yes, absolutely. And I think just moving on to the last point there about this bias and are we talking to the right people? I always find at the back of my mind when I see an intention survey, about are you planning a trip in this time or other, I do wonder about the people who aren't planning a trip, and whether we can ever really get to these people who don't travel. And whether it's important for us to quantify that, or whether it actually is sufficient. Does it matter if we've got this bias?
I think so long as people are cognizant of the fact that that is going on, in a sense, it matters less. But the risk is that people jump to a conclusion that they see a stat coming out of a survey and they completely believe it, and they believe that it applies to everybody in society, whereas you have to be really careful to think about, well, who have they interviewed, how have they interviewed them, but also, as I'm trying to make the point there, need to be mindful of, well, who is it that is behind this survey? Now, 9 out of 10 surveys are done brilliantly well and are shining a really good light in building our understanding, but perhaps 1 in every 10 may be more about PR than they are about insights. You always have to be really careful and critique, if you like. So not criticize, but critique a survey before you just jump in and believe everything that you might read from it.
True. Very, very good advice there, David. I think we will leave it there for this snapshot, just to say Do visit etoa.org/insight if you would like to see a variety of reports and insights that we have collated for you there by category. And we will see you on the next snapshot. Goodbye.